I always find, prior to giving one of these presentations, it's always useful to look at the abstract to find out what I'm supposed to be talking about. Apparently, I've started work on a number of new features in the editor. Okay, yes, that part is true. There should be ample time for discussion and suggestions from the audience. That part is also very true. I have no idea how long this little presentation is going to take. I'm just going to talk through some of the problems we have with editing classes in Dyalog, and then I'm going to walk through some of the tentative solutions that we have, which hopefully will lead us through into what we might also be able to do and give you guys the opportunity to point out what you don't like about where we're going with the editor, and maybe throw out some new suggestions as well. So I suppose I'm going to sit down as well for this, so I'm going to end up doing a certain amount of typing, and typing standing up is a bit of a chore. So I'm going to sit down, and that will also stop my head from getting in the way there. Okay, it was quite pleasing actually earlier when Morton asked how many people had edited classes. There was, I don't know whether it was a couple of dozen of you, but there was a goodly number of you that put your hands in the air. So you'll be familiar with some of the problems that we're trying to address here. Let me start by opening a class in the parser. This is a pre-existing, in the editor, sorry. This is a pre-existing class that we have. I think it was written by Dan or Morton. And if I open the existing editor on this class, okay, it's got colon class at the top. There's a bunch of comments, and then as we scroll down through this, there's a function here. It's actually a constructor for the class that's called init. There are a number of field definitions. There's even a few defun definitions up here. And there is sort of stuff throughout this class which, unless we know what we're looking for, it's sort of difficult to find. Look, here's a function that's called parse, and so on. So when one's looking at a class, and this isn't even a particularly large one, if I put line numbers on, there's only 100 or so. Oh no, there's more than that. There's only 170 odd lines in this class. It's by no means a large thing. But it's sort of a bit of a chore to find where everything is in the editor. Okay. Worse than that, if I have this class and I want to, for example, add a new function to it, so if I paren ed new fun, let's call it, when I hit enter here, I get an empty window which is seemingly completely disassociated from the class that we were just looking at. If I want to look at an existing function that's in that class, like for example, there was a thing called init in there, quadec.parser.init exists, we know that, we've seen it, but if I open the editor here, again we get an empty box, which isn't particularly helpful. If I modify this and save it, nothing particularly interesting happens. However, if someone else modified it and knew what they were doing, let's just find out. Let's just go down in here. Nothing particularly interesting has happened to the class. Okay. Worse than that, if I'm inside this guy and I'm editing it, and I want to add a new function, say inside, let's just find something here. Inside this thing called parse, let's say that in here I want to edit something called, parse sub, for example. So I want to define this function. If I type parse sub there and hit shift enter to invoke the editor, I get an empty window which is seemingly disassociated from my class definition, which is again not particularly helpful. So you can sort of see the sort of problems with the editor where it is sort of designed primarily, for editing single functions rather than complete class definitions. Let me now come out of this interpreter and start the new IDE enhanced version. And first of all, let's edit the same class to see what is immediately new. Okay, so there's additional stuff. On the right-hand side, we have all the text of the class as we had before. But in addition, we've got these little brackets down the left-hand side. I've got a red dot somewhere. There's this little bracketing system here, which is trying to bracket related lines of code. So here we've got a block of comments which are grouped together. Here we have some glyphs to say, look, here's a defund definition, and we've got some glyphs here to say, look, this is a line of code that's got a field on it. And then we have this bracketing graphic to show us, look, that here's a function. Okay, and there's the end of the function. Here's another little bunch of comments and so on, and some more functions. But most usefully, on the left-hand side here, we have a new tree view. And if I drop down, for example, the methods drop down, we can see that inside this class there is something called parse and something called switch. If I click on either of these, it highlights in the class definition where that function is defined. If I click on parse, it scrolls the window and takes me to where that function is defined. Similarly, for all of the fields that are defined in the class, they appear in this tree view in alphabetical order. So if I click on delimiter, we're taken to where that line is defined in the script. And as I move down with the right arrow, we can see that we're taken through all the lines in the script where these fields are defined. Okay. And there's a separate list also for constructors. There was one function in here called init, which was the constructor for the class. And I can easily find where that is in the class by using this tree view.
Can you create or line numbers in the function?
I can put line numbers on for the entire class. Okay, if I... Right, exactly, and that's something that I've not addressed yet, but it would also be useful to have in it. I'm struggling to get line numbers on at the moment. There they are. It would be nice to subdivide the line numbers on the per function basis as well, so that when you do get an error on line 4 of such and such a function, that's clearly labelled. That's something that is intended to be done too. Okay. So let me just make sure that I've covered everything I needed to cover up until now. Oh, okay. Now, the other thing that... no, we'll come back to that in a moment. Right. So that was a class that I had nothing to do with the designing of. And hopefully you can see that at least it's a little easier for me now to navigate through that to find out where things are and how the class is laid out. Let's move on a little bit to a class that I do know something about. We shall load the now infamous CD database. And what I've been doing while I've been going through this process of working with the editor is that I've taken the CD database, which had no OO components in it at all, and try and generate some OO classes in that to sort of make that into a much more OO-y application than it was before. It was sort of faking it before. I did a lot of things with anonymously named namespaces to implement the whole database. Now I'm trying to bring that into a more formal OO arrangement. And I've particularly only wanted to do that when I was working at the editor at the same time, so that I could identify the problems that we would come across and fix up the editor accordingly. So, for example, now there is a class in here called disk, okay, which is a class that defines what a disk entry in the database is. And we can see at the top of the class all the public fields that are the attributes of a class that I want to be visible from the outside. And we have this little glyph in the corner. You perhaps can't quite see that, but those are supposed to be little Fs for field in a little diamond. Okay, and then we can see again, there's my fill function, and here is my constructor function at the bottom. It's a much smaller class, but again, all the tools allow me to navigate through. Let's look at my fill function. Let's look at my constructor, and I can scroll through all of the fields. Again, alphabetical order on the left so that you can easily find them as you're scanning through, and then obviously in the order that they were defined in the code on the right-hand side. Now, if we look in, actually this class probably isn't a good example. If we look at this, this probably is a good example. Yeah, okay, let's say that I now want to add a new method to this class. Okay, I could start typing here, or I could right-click here and say, give me a new method. Okay. I am prompted for the name of the new method, and it occurred to me this morning as I was preparing this that what would be a much better thing to have here would be the full signature for the method, the name, whether or not it returns a result, and the argument list that you want to give it. But for the moment, we're just asking for the single name. So I'm going to call this function directory, And then we get a stub directory function with the little brackets inside the editor. And I can now modify this function, make it a public function. Okay. And what it's going to do, it's going to return I will have an existing function called file of that returns either the file or the directory of the entry in the database. So it's going to return the file of the file of the current object. And because file of exists in the root of the workspace, I'll just need to put a hash dot on the front of there. Now we should see it did it actually as I was typing, that the entry here for methods, if I go back and change the name of this thing, you can see that the tree on the left is keeping in sync with the method as I modify its name, directory, if I could type its name. Okay, so we can now fix the class. Okay, and now I can do. Now that was an instance function, so I need to execute that on an instance of the disk class. Fortunately, I have a vector here of some 200 of them. So the directory of the first disk is that directory on the machine. That is the directory that contains the files, the audio files, for this entry in the database. Now, so that is a way of adding a new function to an existing class. One of the problems that I illustrated before was if I was in the session and I wanted to add a function called, for example, also by to the class. Okay, this would give me an empty window. If I hit Shift-Enter now on this expression, the class is opened with, again, this blank function implementation inside the class. If I hit Escape now, then that will be fixed in the class. Creates it right away, yeah. Now, if I hit Enter again, it takes me back to that point in there. Okay. Shift-Escape would have cancelled would have come out of the class without putting that function in there. That you would have to do with QuadFX, hopefully that question won't mean much to a lot of people. I don't really want to have to explain the question because I'm not particularly proud of the answer. Yes, so can I not answer that question? Can I skip that? Is that okay? Okay, so this function is also going to be accessed public. Okay. And what I'm going to do for no reason other than it illustrates something else that we've changed in the editor. This is going to return the result of a function called also by, all in lowercase. Okay. The reason I'm doing that is that I'm now going to hit Shift-Enter on this name in the editor, and I get another blank function in my class, which I can now populate with the result that I want for the expression. And the result, again, is a lot of this stuff still exists in hash because I haven't completed the OO migration. But what we want to do is get all of the disks by the artist. Oh, that should be a curly. By the artist that is given by the full name of the artist in this object, in this instance of the class. Okay, and therefore this needs to be also by the artist that recorded this entry in the database. So if I fix this guy, won't work? Because I didn't give that an argument. And that's a good reason also for if we have a message box here that says, what name do you want to give this thing? That it could prompt me with, does it want to return a result and does it take any arguments? In fact, I don't need to give it an argument at all because because these are all instance functions. That's not strictly true. Because these are both instance functions, then the artist.fullname is available in the lowercase version of the function too. So if we do pick disks dot also by, we will get an error. Right, actually, this is interesting because, we might as well leap ahead a little bit. One of the other problems that I didn't show you because I forgot when I showed you how this used to work was that if I trace into a function what the interpreter used to do is just display that one function in an edit window without any of the context of where it was within the class. And that, in some ways, is a nice thing. We're used to that as APL programmers. We're used to only being able to see a single function at a time. But when you're developing a class where a lot of things tend to be quite tightly interrelated, it's a little bit frustrating sometimes. So now if I trace into this also by function, the tracer now displays the whole class definition, the whole script that we've been working on, but it just highlights the section of the script that is the function that we're currently inside. So if I trace through this, okay, if I trace into this also by function, we'll see the black section change to the new function definition. Okay, and I can see my mistake here because I've written disk by, and disk is the class. Okay, the vector of all the disks in the collection is actually called disks. So we can fix that in situ in the class script, fix the thing, and carry on, and there's our result. And we can see that there are, in the first 200 disks in the collection, 200 of something like 2,200 at the moment, but I've only converted some of them to 00. There are 5 disks by the band called Dream Theater in the collection. But the point I was trying to make there was when we add a function, the default point and click behavior is to, for a name that doesn't exist, is to add it in the same class script. And incidentally, an undo here, Control-Shift backspace, will delete that function and take my cursor back to the point where I hit Shift-Enter. So if it's not right, throw the whole thing away and go back to exactly where you were. There are a few things on a context menu, one of which currently works, which I will show you in a moment, and we can extend the useful context menu as we go on. Okay, so that's that one, that's that one, that's that one. Okay, so one of the things that's in this class, or one of the things that's in this database is that there is a vector of names. There are 1,407 unique artist names in the database. And these are all currently instances of an unnamed namespace based on a template called name. These currently are not 00 objects. They're just old-style namespaces in the workspace. What I thought I would do now is just go through the process of modifying my disk class to use and create instances of something called name, which is a new class which we'll define on the fly. Now, what I have here on line 39 is what this says is, I should actually explain what entry is. What the database does is when I insert a CD into the drive, if I had one, which I don't on this machine, it uses an Activex control from a company called Gracenote, which reads the table of contents from the CD, which is essentially the start and end point of every track. So you get a 10 or 11 or a 12 element numeric vector. The CD database Activex control allows me to send that vector across the internet to their database, and it returns information about the artist that recorded that CD. It turns out that the number of tracks on a disk and the starting point on the disk is a very good, not quite unique identifier on the CD, but it's actually a very good way of finding a single CD from that information. I think of the 200 CDs that I've so far converted into instances of the 00 class, about 4 or 5 of them found multiple matches in the database. So that list of start and end information is a pretty good identifier of a particular CD. And what entry then is basically the result from that Activex control. It's a COM object that contains lots and bits and pieces of information about the CD that I've inserted. An artist.fullname basically just retrieves a second object that contains the information. But what I wanted to do here was, rather than use this thing called hash.addName, I wanted to set the artist to be a new instance of a class called hash.name. Okay, and I'm going to give it as the argument the entry.artistFullname that we had before. Now, if I hit Shift-Enter here, because we've got hash dot on the front of that definition, it's not going to define something called name inside this class. It's going to define it in the root of the workspace in hash. Now, Shift Edit by default assumes that I'm going to be inserting a function. If I want to make this a class, there's a couple of things I have to do. I have to make it look like a class. Okay. So we can put class and end class. And then I can use the change type entry on the menu here to say, actually, this isn't a function. This is going to be a class or a namespace. And once I do that, then we get all the class/namespace attributes that we've been talking about for the duration of the presentation. If I want to add then a new constructor to this guy, I can right-click on Constructors and do New Constructor, which I'm going to call, I'll let the default name do that. So I get a public instance constructor into which I can now start writing some code. Now, in the root of my namespace, I have a thing called new name. Okay, that's the first bug, which I'm going to essentially take and insert into this class definition. Hold on. Let's just take, I'll tell you what, things seem to be going a little awry, so let me fix that and look at new name. Okay. I'm just going to take this code from here and I'm going to insert it into the class. Now, one of the things that it occurred to me again as I was going through this, preparing for today, was wouldn't it be great if we had a pop-up on this function that said, move this function into such and such a class. That, I think, would be a useful thing. That's sort of exactly what I want to do now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into the clipboard. I'm going to edit my name, which didn't fix properly. Okay, let's just go through that process again. Class, name, end class. Okay, change type. It also occurs to me that it would be nice. Oh, that's okay. It'll let me do it anyway. And the reason it's red, of course, is because it was syntactically incorrect. Okay, so we do that. We add a new constructor, which we'll call that. You'll notice that when I did that, the caret, the insert position, moved down into the constructor to the place where I'm expected to start writing my code. I'm going to paste this stuff in, and I'm just going to do, I'm going to have a local variable. Well, first of all, I'm going to have a variable called names. We don't need any of this stuff anymore. Names gets entry dot, and then I want to get the full name, the full name, the last name, the first name, and the. Yeah. Okay. And so what that does is it extracts from this COM object that I got back from the online thing. That's extracted its full name, last name, and first name elements. And then I'm just going to assign each of those names into global variables in this class. Okay? Now, that's names, plural. Entry, of course, was an argument to the constructor. So if it had asked me, when it asked me for the name of the thing, then I would have provided that information there, but I'll add it here now. Now, names I intend to be a local variable in this function. Now, this actually is something that exists in the editor already. If I do control up arrow at this point, then names is localized and put on line 0 of the function that I'm currently editing. So that little keyboard shortcut, which many of you, I'm sure, are already aware of, will also work in class scripts to localize the name on line 0 of the current function that you're editing. Okay. Now, these assignments to full name, first name, last name, and that I've got there on line 6 of the script, I intend those to be assignments to public fields so that I can interrogate them from outside later. If I just do this assignment here, then they essentially become private variables, and I won't be able to dig at them using the dot syntax later. So I want to convert each of these names into public fields. Now, if I've done everything right, which I'm sure I haven't. Right, on the top of my menu now, I have an entry called Refactor that contains 3 elements at the moment. The only one so far that we've implemented is add as field. And what that does, it takes the name underneath the caret and creates an instance field of that name in my class script. So I can just go through, right-click on each of these names and say add as a field. And the editor is clever enough to group all of my field definitions together. In fact, I think what it does is as it did with the methods, was it adds the new one at the top of all the existing ones. And we would intend to configure that because I know a lot of people like to write code top-down or bottom-up or whatever. So we can configure that so that they will either be added at the beginning or at the end and so on. Or you can switch it off, of course. Okay, so now that I've done that, that's my name class with a constructor. There's an error in there, but I can't for the life of me remember what it is. So we'll fix that.
After the word constructor 0,
Yeah.
why do you need no punctuation before it?
Well, that's the right argument to the function.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and in fact, if I reformat this, then everything squishes in, the extraneous white space goes away. So entry is the argument to the constructor, and then names is a local variable in there.
Digressing, can I ask a question? How are you doing on not reformatting?
We always reformat. If I was to close this and come back in, it would be reformatted.
And if I don't want that?
At the moment, you don't have the choice in Dyalog. Yeah. And it's one of those things that we discuss/argue long and hard about whether it's desirable to do it or not, and what's the best way of not doing it if we decide to remove the formatting. So it's something that frequently comes up for discussion, but at the moment, we always do the formatting.
But it's still interesting. Good.
It will, from my point of view, it will be in discussion until we change it. Which, actually, from anyone's point of view, it'll be in discussion until we change it. It doesn't mean we'll change it, but it will be in discussion until that happens. There are a number of reasons, actually, why removing some of the formatting would be a good idea. So, anyway, so now, do I want to mention that? I don't really want to mention that, so I'm just going to fix that class now, and I'm going to do a quad new on. I'm going to create a new disk. In fact, before I do that, let me show you a couple of these things. The disks is a vector of 200 CDs, each of which has a table of contents. Okay, so the first table of content looks like that. Okay, so this is saying that on the first disk in the collection, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tracks. The 150 is just a little tag, and then the rest are starting positions on the disk. Okay, and this is the key information that I pass to the disk constructor when I want to create a new one of these. So if I trace into quad new disk, passing that value, we go straight into the constructor of the disk class. Again, we've got all of the outlining and the methods and so on showing in the tree, so that we can still go through here and look at all of the things that we're not looking that are in there. Go back to my constructor. Okay, and as I trace through this guy, I just hadn't initialized my connection to that database. Okay, so now we have extracted from the online database information about the disk that has this table of contents. We can trace through the rest of our class. Here we have a quad new hash.name, trace into that. I got that message earlier and I have no idea what it means, but I'll fix that. So now we've switched classes. We're now looking inside the name class where we can extract the names from the entry. And the reason I've got this wrong is that entry actually doesn't contain something called full name. It contains something called just name. Entry.name is the full name of the artist. So I need to edit this, take that off. Okay. And so on and so forth. If we go into this guy, there is a function inside the credit class, which given a collection of credits goes through and extracts them all and creates a new instance of this class, and so on. It uses the old version of the old code to create a name because we didn't change the constructor for the credit class. Anyway, so that's sort of the process there of creating a new class. The key things were that the editing the hash.name in the disk class opened a new editor on something called name in the root of the workspace. We could then easily convert its type from what the default is, which was a function, to a class. We can write our code, and then we can easily factor some what were local variables out into public fields in the class. Okay. I should point out, actually, at this point, in fact, I should have pointed out half an hour ago, that this stuff is not in the conference edition that's on your memory stick. It's not deemed to be ready for public consumption yet. We will plan to get a test version of this out for feedback at some point, but I'm not sure where that fits into the schedule of everything that we need to do when we get back. Okay, so there's a couple of other things that I will just show you, just because they are cool but completely useless. And also one thing which I think is actually quite important. If I wanted to edit a new class called Notes, okay, the circle there to the left of Notes tells the editor to invoke on a class rather than on a function. So we then go straight into a class without having to change the types. If I add a new method here, okay, let's just add a new method, method 0. Okay, if I say I want this to be access public, okay, and I misspell access, okay, if I now try and fix the class, I get a dialog box that says there have been errors fixing the class because we didn't recognize the word access because it was spelled incorrectly. Now, the previous version of the editor would not let me exit the editor with errors in the class definition. Okay, now, in hindsight, this is a development environment, and as a few of you guys have pointed out to us, you don't want to have everything working before you can save your work. So there is an option here to say, okay, there's been errors, but do you want to save the definition anyway? And if we hit yes, then clearly Notes is fixed, and we can go back and edit it again. If I now try and come out, it asks me again, unless I hit the box that says don't ask me again. And then the interpreter remembers the answer to the question for currently all classes that I might fix in my development environment. But maybe it should apply to just this single class, for example. Of course, if I try and create an instance of this class, having saved it with errors, then the quad new is going to fail. It's going to say you can't use this yet because it's in an unknown internal state. Essentially, all we've done is remember the text and not made a complete class out of that. Okay, but on the note of misspelling things, let me open my disk class again. And you remember here we have a thing called FromToc, which is a constructor, and some methods. I'm embarrassed to show you this, but I think it's kind of nifty. FromToc is my constructor. If I misspell constructor, or as I'm typing constructor, you'll see that it moves from the top, from being a constructor to being a function, which I think is quite cool, and we quite intended that, but having shown it to you, I'm sort of not sure that it's a good idea to distinguish between constructors and methods in that way. It might be a better idea to have the constructors listed under the methods with a tag on it to say, this one's a constructor. But the idea is that we sort of maybe went a little bit overboard on how much it does dynamically, and it only detects the thing as a constructor when I finish off that one word, which is kind of neat, but sort of largely pointless. Sorry? Well, it does, yeah, okay. It auto-completes on the implements. Oh, I pressed the wrong button somewhere. But not on the constructor, and arguably it should do that anyway. Okay, so essentially, I think that, let me just check, that's where we're at the moment. Blah, 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 blah. It looks good, it just has blah, blah, blah written on it. It's a good joke, I like it. Right, so what else might we do? Well, obviously there's a lot of scope for refactoring other things out. In my disk function here, I have this little dfun here. It might be nice to have a pop-up to say extract this bit of code and promote it to not a local function in this function, but put it somewhere in the class. There's also arguments for extracting say I just take 3 bits of code here, that it might be nice to be able to refactor that into a little sub-function in the class. Although the logic of figuring out from those 4 lines of code what's supposed to be an argument to the function, what would be results, what would be local variables in it, and what would be references to fields, and what might be functions, is a little bit difficult, which is why we've not done it yet. There's also, let me go back to this quadc.parser thing, which I know nothing about, but fortunately, if you see Vector article in volume 19.4, it will tell you everything you need to know about this thing. But it might be fun to, where we've got this, the brackets here in the code, it might be useful to bracket between this if and the corresponding end if, or between this if and the end if, so that you could, the eye would easily see where those sections began and ended. And then, of course, we could also, if we got really brave, we could put little pluses and minuses here to allow you to expand and contract and hide those bits of the code. It's something Visual Studio does that I've never used. So I'm not sure whether or not you guys would think that that's a good idea. And that would also apply, you know, for the if statements as well. We can do that regardless of whether you're editing classes or not. In many cases, if you have a large function, you might not want to wade through a big switch statement or a big bunch of if-then-elses and so on. Right. Yeah, so as Ray says, it's the sort of thing that when you need it, you really need it, but you only need it occasionally. But it's something, again, that we could do. And then the question is, for example, here, if I create another class inside here called inner, okay, then the outlining, and it hasn't worked. Oh, there it is. No, it hasn't. Oh. If I put a function inside here, okay, then we get sort of a hierarchy in the nesting, which may very quickly become unwieldy when you have some ifs and thens and elses in there. So what we might be better off doing, and again, this is all open really for your feedback, is to sort of flatten these things into a single line, which again is also what Visual Studio does for these sorts of reasons. But again, this is obviously in development, and we can tweak with it as much as we or you guys like until we're happy with it. Kai? Yeah, we've talked about that as well. The point there, just to rephrase a question, is if, for example, I'm on any of these tags that have got the brackets, it would be nice, for example, on this line of code, if I hit, you know, Control-Shift-E or whatever keystroke assignment you gave it, it automatically moved the caret to the end of that tag. And if there was a tag between this if and this end if, then it would be great to have a keystroke that took me from one end to the other. We have talked about that, but we haven't done it yet. But it's not difficult at all. And I have a word here which I can't read. It's definitely not blah. No, I don't know. So we'll leave that. So essentially, that's sort of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the experience of editing the classes a lot easier than it currently is. Hopefully you'll see that a number of the things that we've talked about, while currently are only in there specifically for classes, could be extended to regular functions. You know, the outlining that we have on the left here is one of those, certainly one of those things. And there was at least one other which escapes me at the moment. So that basically, fortunately, with 3 minutes to go for ample questions and feedback, is all we have. So if there's any feedback that anybody wants to give me now or ask any questions, that would be fantastic. Ray?
Numbers like that don't help in the slightest.
No. Yes, they help when we fix this. If I was to fix this with an error in it, so if I do :blur, okay, then the status window down here does give me the line in the script that the blur was on. But it doesn't, so it helps you when you're editing your script, but it doesn't help you when you're tracing through the thing and you get a quad EN, not quad EN, sorry, a quad LC of 6. You need to know where that is with the other stuff. I mean, obviously, if you run this thing and it crashes on line 6 of the function, then the editor will pop up in the correct place. but you still have to do that small amount of mental arithmetic to get from the line number of the error to the appropriate bit in the script. Well, I mean, there's obviously a number of ideas that we had. We could make this 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, for example, perhaps, but we haven't yet landed on an idea that everyone really likes. Yeah, then we could have a key that took you from one to the other. The number of options.
The other point is the numbers are on the wrong side of the bracket.
Well, that was the other thing that we talked about. The reason that, yes, there are interesting technological reasons for that, which while interesting are not necessarily justifiable. So, yes, it would be nice if the bracket was next to the code rather than to the left of the line numbers.
The numbers are the whole thing in the bracket, not the separate.
Exactly, yeah, the brackets of the code. Yeah, exactly. I was aware of that, but didn't want to change it fairly close to the conference. Well, I was asked to, so didn't want to. Let me go over to Paul, because he had a question. Yes. Yeah. Right. Well, okay. Well, I mean, we're doing it because a number of people, including myself, have realised that it's necessary. Certainly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, for example, because I misspelled access just means that we couldn't have determined that the function was public. Yeah. Yeah, that would get executed when the thing is fixed. And this, I think, was another point that came up in the users group, was wouldn't it be nice to have a way of fixing the thing without running any of those initializers? And maybe what we've got here is not an ideal solution because it addresses one of the problems and not the other. Maybe we need a keystroke or some other way of saying, just save this as is. Don't even try to fix any of it. Or maybe not trust it at all. So that we can decide. We can make that decision. What we've got at the moment is a quick, it didn't fix properly for whatever reason, therefore you can't use it. But again, if enough of you, or if one of you thinks strongly enough that it should be fixed so that what will work, then we can do it that way too. Charles, you have a question?
I very much like the fact that I can see the context when I'm looking at a function.
Great.
So I wonder if you could give me a little bit more options than how that's done. When you're executing,
Okay.
you were showing us that there's a color coding so we can see the context,
Yeah.
but also can see the beginning and end of the function in question.
Yeah.
Shading.
Yeah.
Might be nice to have something similar when we're writing the stuff.
Right. Well, when we're writing the stuff at the moment, it's the only delineation is with the lines. We could perhaps do colours there as well.
You see the point I'm showing.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Another related idea that isn't necessarily in conflict would be to let this whole thing operate as I think the word's list view, where you can collapse parts of this so that you have a little more control over what you're seeing.
yeah, I mean that was the point. We could certainly collapse any of these sections.
Yeah.
Okay. What I haven't shown you, but I'm into Roger's time, so let me briefly show you. Forgive me, Roger. I'll just be 30 seconds with this. The Workspace Explorer, okay, also has a facility here. If we go into quadc.parser, for example, there's the script, and we have all this information here too. Now, we could, on the right-hand side, display this as a bunch of icons, one icon per function. So when you clicked on those, it either took you to the appropriate place in the script or just showed you the text for that one function, perhaps. That would maybe be useful. I'll take one more question, then I must stop. Kai, I think you had your hand up. This is one that Salt currently uses. Possibly, although I can't really comment on that. I mean, it's a question for more. I mean, if enough people are it's undocumented, people don't really know about it unless they've looked to see how salt works. I can't really answer that question. Morton will have to answer that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes, that's not going to change. Yeah. No. It could easily change, yes, if as an idea we can discuss it and see how much merit it's got. But there's no reason why it couldn't do that. Yeah, okay. I must stop because